It's time to test you again. So one more time, I want you to pause the video and draw the structure for glucose, please. Alright, so let's see if you're correct. So we got a 6 carbon chain. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. You're going to hear me beat this dead horse over and over and over. So we see an OH group to the right, and we see one to the left, and the other one to the right, and the other one to the right, and then this down here at the bottom now is just a CH2OH group. And then we fill in our hydrogens as we need them. Okay, so this is the structure for glucose. I told you to memorize it. You should have the structure memorized, and the reason I'm telling you to memorize it is because glucose is the most abundant of the carbohydrates. So most of the time when we talk about carbohydrates, or when we look at carbohydrates, or we look at reactions for carbohydrates, the most common carbohydrate that we are regarding is glucose. And that's because it's so important for our daily activities from day to day to day. It is the most abundant carbohydrate. Cells oxidize glucose, and this is how you get energy to move, to blink, to breathe, to transport yourself back and forth from school, to study, to take those horrible exams at the end of the semester, to make fun of people. Whatever you do on a daily basis, you can thank glucose for allowing that to happen. Now, when cells have too much glucose, they change. So we can have too much glucose in our system. And when there's too much, what happens is that your body changes the structure into something that we call glycogen. Glycogen. And glycogen is kind of like a savings account. What happens is that you are out there and you are feeding your body glucose. And your body says at a certain point, okay, so I need this much glucose in order to operate on a daily basis. So this is what's coming in through the front door. And you're making a little bit too much money. So you're making a little bit too much glucose now, and I'm going to be responsible, and I'm going to take this extra glucose, and I'm going to kind of store it back into a savings account for you. And that way, when you run out of glucose, or you don't give me enough glucose on what I need to work, I can tap into the savings account, and I can begin to withdraw these little deposits of glucose. Okay, so that sounds like a wonderful idea, right? Your body's looking out for you. Your body's taking this extra glucose and your body is storing it, and then your body is taking it as it sees it needs it, so that way you don't have to worry about it. The problem, though, is that glycogen is the issue that people have when it concerns good little carbohydrate pockets of what we regard as fat, even though by definition it's not classified as a fat per se, it's still classified as a carbohydrate. So these glycogen pockets are broken down into individual glucose units when your body needs them. Therefore, glycogen is our first polymer that we are going to run across. So glycogen that gets stored in the human body or glucose that gets stored in the human body is stored as glycogen. Glycogen is broken down to release individual glucose units. That way, when your body needs them, it can take them. Okay, so the way that I can maybe draw that is we see glucose hooked up with glucose, hooked up with glucose, and so on. This whole thing, this polymer chain, is called glycogen. And your body will go through and it will cleave one glucose unit off at a time as it needs it in order to supply your body with enough energy to get it through for the day. Plants do this as well. However, in plants, it's not stored as glycogen. In plants, it's stored as starch. Very often you hear about potatoes and the starchiness of potatoes. And if you talk to a nutritionist, they will tell you and talk to you about stay away from the starches because starches can lead, to overweight problems and little fat around the belly and the thighs and the buttocks. And this is the culprit. It's the carbohydrates that are doing it. Very early on, years and years ago, I guess, early on into some people's diets was the Atkins Diet. And if you take a look at the Atkins Diet, basically it told you to cut out all of the carbohydrates in your body. Every single one of them. And some of those things people were like, what? Why do I not supposed to eat a potato? Well, the potato is carbohydrate. The carbohydrate is a starch. Starch gets stored as glycogen, and that glycogen gets stored up to make you overweight if you eat too much of glucose. Okay, so what's the bigger story here? We're talking about glycogen for animal. We're talking about starch for the plant. There's some other polymers, though, that you need to be aware of before I go further and talk about fat pockets. And these two other polymers are cellulose and cotton. Cellulose, of course, is the structure component of plants. That tree limb out there, that tree limb is holding its shape. It has some strength to it. That's why it doesn't crack. That's why it doesn't break. And a part of that strength is coming from cellulose. The plants that grow up from the ground, well, they're standing up for a reason. There's a structural component involved that keeps them upright. And that structural component is cellulose. It's another polymer of glucose. So plants have glucose, vegetables have glucose, animals have glucose. There's really no way around glucose at all. It is found everywhere. Sorry, Mr. Atkins. And then we look at cotton. It's another form of glucose, and this makes up the hard shells of things like shrimp and crabs, right? So this cotton is the hard shells. And I'm just going to put crabs here, but any crustacean, any exoskeleton of an insect would classify as the same thing. These are all carbohydrates. It's all made up of glucose. And the way that we obtain glucose, we don't make it per se. We have to ingest it. We have to have an intake of it through our food. Okay, so glucose is termed as a carbohydrate. Well, if I didn't want to use the term carbohydrate, I can use another term, and we can call it a saccharide. It means the same thing, it's just a different term. If I didn't want to use saccharide, I can also use the term sugar. Carbohydrates are your sugars, people. Your glucose is a sugar. Your sucrose is a sugar. Your fructose is a sugar. All of these sugars are classified as carbohydrates. So when we tell you to limit your carbohydrate intake, that's fancier saying limit your sugar intake. Stay off of the breads. Stay off of all of those starchy foods. Stay off of the sweets. Stay off of anything that's sugary and that tastes good, because anything that tastes good is bad for you. We all know that, right? If it pleases your tongue, then you better not eat any more of it, because probably sooner or later you're going to see the results of something like that around your hips and your thighs again a little bit later if you eat too much of it. Okay, so all of these are synonymous. Carbohydrates, saccharides, sugars, they're all meaning the same thing. Glucose, of course, is the culprit. If I eat too much glucose, aka if I eat too much sugar, what happens is that my body takes the extra sugar and it stores it inside of a savings account, and my weight gets larger and larger and larger. As I work out, as I move, as my body requests some energy, then it will take those sugar savings accounts and it will begin to deplete them. And hopefully, if we are a little bit overweight, we can take these sugar deposits and bring those balances down to zero. We want to withdraw everything that we can out of there, and that way we can be nice, lean, and trim. Some of us have a better time doing that than some of the others, but it's a job at least for everybody, right? Okay, so we can classify the carbohydrates in this way: saccharide, sugar, carbohydrate. Not only that, but glucose is going to be termed what we call a simple carbohydrate. So a simple carb. A simple carbohydrate basically means one sugar structure. That's it. So for instance, single carb would be glucose. However, glucose and glucose can hook up together and it can start to form this kind of short polymer, if you want to look at it that way. And if I have two carbohydrates that are hooked up together, that's not called a simple carbohydrate anymore. That's called a complex carbohydrate. So this is where the term simple carb and complex carb come into the picture. Simple carbohydrates sometimes are called monocarbohydrates. Mono, of course, meaning one. Complex carbohydrates, well, these can go by a couple of different names. If there's two here, like we've done, this is called a disaccharide. Right? If there's 3 units, glucose, 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 it's still a complex carbohydrate, but we call this a trisaccharide. If you've got 4 or more, some people regard it as 3 or more, but if you do have more than 3 glucose units that are hooked up, we call these oligosaccharides. And then if you've got 10 or more, so let's put 10 plus here, we call these the polysaccharides. So just some more terminology that we have to go through, right? So depending, and I'm using glucose as an example here, but keep in mind it can be any carbohydrate. It doesn't have to be glucose. It could be fructose. It could be any kind of carbohydrate or sugar that it wants to be. We're just using glucose as the point of reference. If it's one sugar, it's called a simple carbohydrate, or what we know as a monosaccharide. If it's 2 sugars hooked up, it's a disaccharide. 3 sugars, trisaccharide. You could also use oligosaccharide there if you wanted. 3 or more, between 3 and 10, you're looking at oligosaccharide. And then if you look at greater than 10, you're looking at a polysaccharide. So just more ways to kind of break this terminology down, to talk about these structures, and to realize what we have on our hands. So the classification scheme is not done yet. We need to at least address one more issue of classification, and that way we can be all set to talk about the D and the L notation.